Thanks, y'all. I know we got the afternoon lull here, so let's keep it going. But hey, again, my name's Carlos Huerta. I'm from the little big town of Carruthers, California, which is 25 minutes southwest of this city that I now live and play in called Fresno, California. That story for me is very personal, and just a few images of our Central Valley is I grew up in a little farm town, right? Son of two immigrant parents, and oftentimes, you've heard me say this before, but Fresno often makes the top of a lot of bad lists: drunkest city, teenage pregnancy, gang violence, substance abuse. And so when you look at Fresno, that's me. That's my family. And like growing up for us, like traffic in Carruthers was like 5 cars behind a tractor on a one-way road. I hopped to Fresno, and all of a sudden I stuck in traffic for 20 minutes trying to get around the corner. And so the city never sleeps, it feels like. And if this is dangerous, but if you just close your eyes with me, please don't fall asleep with me. I want you to just picture the noises that we hear in an urban center. The family up late barbecuing, soccer and softball practices getting out late, that 4-year-old toddler who won't go to sleep, looking at you, Mateo Huerta. And, you know, if you live in my neighborhood, you might hear the dunce, 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 because it's some parranda. Somebody's throwing a fiesta in my hood every Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday on a weekday. Welcome to inner city Fresno. But if you pause for a little bit, and you go beyond some of those noises, you'll start to hear some of the cries of the pain of the things that tear at the fabric of the well-being of our city. You have a family who's close to eviction because a payday lender latched on to their finances in their time of need. You'll see a parent who fell on hard times, potentially leaving a situation of domestic violence, and now they're all alone with their 2 kids. And because of their situation, they had to make some really tough decisions on how to make it to next month. And now Child Protective Services is here to take their 2 kids away. And when I liken this story to what I see and live in Scripture, and just a little bit of context in Fresno, but I often think of 2 Kings 4, right? And the widow's oil as we jump into this. But this woman, and I often think of Elisha, right? And not Elijah, but Elisha, the guy that came after Elijah. My man's walking through the hood because this woman comes up to Elisha. And so this situation doesn't happen if Elisha's not already present. The other piece that's really powerful to me is this woman comes to him and says, my husband has died. He had a really big debt, and his creditors are here to take my 2 children away. Theologians will say that her children were probably really young. They weren't able to work yet. And so this woman had the burden of this man who left her this very big debt, and at the same time trying to make sure that her kids stayed in her household. And it blows me away that Elisha goes to her and he asks, how can I help you? What do you have in your house? And I'm like, man, if I came to you for help, like, I don't have anything. Like, help me out, bro. But he pauses, and this woman responds, your servant has nothing there at all. And in my time of crisis in my life, how many times did I also say, I don't have anything? God, like, I need you. But Elisha has this audacity to say, like, you got something. And so he waited a little bit longer, and this woman says, you know what? I do have a little bit of olive oil. And we see in this moment something dormant that this woman didn't realize she had in her life. And how many times do we have people in our communities, in our churches, in our systems, in our associations, and our institutions that you find something that you left in the back corner of the shelf all dusted and you realize it's going to transform what we're going to do. It's this dormant asset that we often talk about. And that's what we often look to do is catalyze, cultivate, and spark these dormant assets in community, just like people did for me in my own personal life. I'll mention one statistic to you, and I'll use payday lending for an example. So in our region, there are more payday lenders than Starbucks and McDonald's combined. And for those of you who may not know the payday lending landscape, any of y'all have credit cards? Probably most of y'all. Y'all know what the APR is? Y'all ashamed to say it, huh? No, but usually it's federally secured between 9 and 30%. Hebrew, if I walk up to you and I'm like, hey man, I got a good deal for you. I got this loan I'm gonna give you. It's only 458%. My man's walking out that office real quick. But that is happening in all our neighborhoods of poverty in Fresno, California, because on one end, banks do not do business in poor neighborhoods. And Brookings found that of the 45 neighborhoods that our census tracks in California, 22 of them are concentrated poverty neighborhoods. 40% or more live under the federal poverty line. And so while payday lenders are set up to provide emergency services, they often become leeches, stripping away this ability to flourish and thrive in a family. And I think of Josie, who came to us in a financial literacy course, and I'll share a little bit more about her, but single mom with an adult special needs son who was a victim of a payday lender. The other piece for us when we think of, Fresno making atop a lot of bad lists and we talk about poverty, we really do see the economics at the heart of shalom in our region. And for us having such a large population that ends up in prison and gets released, we find that if you have a criminal record, you do not qualify for 60% of the jobs in our region. When you have a family, when you've radically transformed your life in these rehabilitation programs, desperation will do a lot to people when they need to feed their families. And that's our lived reality. I think of Jeremy, and I'll mention a little bit about his story too, and the redeeming work that God did in his life. So I'm going to continue on the 2 Kings passage because I see something really radical for me where, like if Elisha said, go around, Carl said, I know you're struggling, but go talk to all your neighbors and tell them what's going on. I'm like, hell no, man. That's not me. I'm hurting. I ain't trying to talk to y'all. But not only that, and personally, growing up in a Latino household, asking for help is a sign of weakness. And in so many of my communities that we serve, asking for help is not okay. Asking for help is not okay. But this man doubles down and he goes, don't just ask for a few. And when we think of jars, we're not thinking about these little mason jars or in other translations, they talk about storage vessels. And so you can think of mismatching Tupperware or whatever, right? In our current context, everybody has a ton of that, right? And in this context, it was very much the same thing, right? There was this abundance of materials. And we found that this woman's way forward out of her situation was to tap into her beloved community. That your community, your neighbors are going to be part of your solution. And we need to tap into what they can offer, which in this form were jars, to move you forward. And so all of a sudden it's all right, I got a little bit of oil, I got a ton of jars. What am I doing here? And what I love in this next part is then Elisha gives her a command, and he gave her kind of a roadmap. Right, go inside your house, shut the door behind you and your sons, and start pouring oil, and as they are filled, put it to one side. I find that to be so beautiful because I don't know how many times I've gone to serve in communities, and I really wish someone would have given me a roadmap. As someone who had the opportunity to jump into a business venture, scale it very quickly, I was thankful to have a lot of creative people that I just said, I don't know what I'm doing, but can you lean in? But how many people in our communities of poverty experience broken community or lack of community, a lack of social capital, if you will? And I'll say this, I don't know if y'all ever have this concept of I know a guy, I know a girl, somebody that knows how to do this. Growing up in Carruthers for us, it's my mom's dishwasher broke. Do you know anybody that can fix it? And they're oh yeah, Luis lives 2 trees down past the cow. Go 3 streets down, you'll find Luis. You'll know when you see him. But doing business isn't very different in our communities. It's oftentimes the social capital that props you up and holds you up. And Dr. Matthew Jackson in Stanford finds that social capital is a big piece of economic mobility. That if you are in a potentially broken situation that I can go to my neighbor and say, I really have to go to work. Can you watch my children for a couple hours? Like, that's part of what community is. And unfortunately, a lot of our neighbors oftentimes lack community around them. And so when I think of this roadmap, I think of this big question that was posed to about 200 faith leaders in our city in 2011. Our mayor at that time, Ashley Swearingen, asked this big question: what is the role of the faith community and the economic well-being of our valley, of our region? And as y'all could imagine, at that time, crickets. Like, we talk about social problems, it's like, oh, church got that. Spiritual problems, we can speak to that. But economics was really hard. And some of this theology of, like, don't turn my church into a marketplace, like that's part of also what we had to address. And this sent us on a year of looking at different models across the country and landing on this idea of social entrepreneurship. We saw that the church was leading the way in hiring people with barriers to employment, reducing landfill waste, creating clean water wells in hill tribes in Thailand. They were using, and Pew Institute finds that between the Great Depression to 2019, charitable contributions in the United States have not budged between 9 and 11%. Like, as a Christian nation, we believe in this 10%. But as churches, foundations, nonprofits, we're competing for this ethereal 10%. What if we could tap into the other 90% of the marketplace to do good? That is often exploiting people, communities, systems, etc. And so we started this process called Spark Tank, right? Which, if you guys have ever seen the show Shark Tank, we always say we're the shark without the teeth, because we're not trying to take equity stake in businesses. We're pulling in our subject matter experts and our business leaders to be supportive cheerleaders in the process, building more social capital. All of a sudden, I have this teenager who is running a custom skateboard shop where he's designing and building skateboards, mentored by one of our tech gurus who has a very large company in our region, right? Talk about social capital. And I threw a bunch of statistics up here, but I think just for us in the last 10 years, we've been able to fund 67 social enterprises, and really this big idea of taking risk in a region that's economically depressed, in the sense that philanthropic investment in Fresno, California is the second lowest per capita across the country. It also has the second highest amount of concentrated poverty across the country. And that really creates a hotbed of desperation, but also of innovation. However, in our context, risk-taking is very expensive. It means next month's rent. It means food on the table this week. And so for us was, can we create margin for people to take risk and do good for community? This idea of community members solving community problems through business, because housed and in our formation at CCT, housed at a university, part of what people come to us for is training and capacity building. And so really for us, this early venture was like, let's give people a ton of money. And then we realized, like, money's good, but they also need to know what to do with money. Because all of a sudden you give the church, here's $5,000 to start this cleaning business. The church has never run a business before, right? And so while the money was great to get them in the door, we do a lot through our accelerators and incubators to build their capacity and to dream of what it is if we use some dormant assets. I'll give some tangible examples here in a little bit. But then, as we started building social businesses, I mentioned the payday lending issue in our region was that since 2012, we've been running a program called Faith and Finances, and some of y'all are probably familiar with our friends at the Chalmers Center. We've been their West Coast trading hub since then. But for us, we found that people are getting jobs, but they've never had a bank account before. They don't know how to steward their finances. And even this simple thing of, like, the difference between wants and needs was a reality for us. Like, I think of my son when we're walking through the store and he's like, Dad, I need that toy. I'm like, dude, you want that toy. So how do we unpack that for him? And unfortunately, in our communities, it wasn't much different, right? And so how do we walk with our neighbors and do what we would call hand-holding, right? And again, up to date, having almost 300 facilitators in 96 churches and 22 nonprofits and 5 Section 8 community centers in our context, because we have found from Section 8, and remember, this is a federal-funded HUD program, our housing program, excuse me. And so when they came to us and say, hey, we'd like to use your program, and we're like, hey, it's a faith-based program, are you sure you want to use it? They found that when their neighbor, or the people in the complexes, were all people of faith, right? And so when they offered workshops that were not of faith, they were poorly completed or attended, right? And they said something remarkable to us. We feel like faith is what's missing in our content. And that radicalized us being able to serve in neighborhoods in a much deeper way than we ever did before, because we had the support of other institutions and systems to back what we were doing. All right, so I've really focused on one side, because then the other thing was, not to keep going, but to keep going. So these 4 pastors came to us and they're like, hey, CCT, do you know how many churches are in Fresno, the Fresno County? About 600. More than 600. Do you know that a third of them are Spanish speaking, but less than 5% of those leaders have ever had any formal theological or leadership training? You should do something about that. And I'm like, man, we got enough to do on this side to figure out the economics of things. How are we going to prop that up? But as we looked at the landscape, it was true that while our English-speaking counterparts had access to resources, rural and central California is very different. It's very Latino. It's very Spanish-speaking, and it's in the shadows, mainly because of undocumentation. Right? We are the breadbasket of the world, but our neighbors go hungry. And agriculture often depends on an undocumented workforce that often becomes exploited. Right? And so as we think of our certificado program, it originally started with this idea of we're going to build capacity of pastors to do this work. And after a couple of years, we did an audit of our program and realized that 70% of our leaders were lay leaders. And so we completely transformed our program to serve pastor, to serve lay leaders. And, during the pandemic, we pivoted and went all online, which was also a big gamble, because you also have a rural technological divide in the Central Valley, and you also have almost a tech-illiterate population that hardly uses technology. And so, but over the last 4 years, we've been able to take this, not just in urban context, but to go rural, and to equip our leaders in community transformation strategies, to engage their communities in new ways, to think of loving their neighbor. I use one example of Pastor Edgar, who, if you know traditional Latino context, this idea of asking for help or mental health is really taboo. And Pastor Edgar, a very traditional pastor, had come a couple weeks prior to when we received this call to a mental health seminar for Gen Z, right? And everything between identity. And he was saying that I'm having a lot more trans students in my population. I'm really scared to talk to them. I don't know what to do with them. And he called that week and he said, because I came to your workshops, I was able to save this trans teen from committing suicide that night because I knew where to send them. And I found that to be so powerful. And so we've essentially repurposed all of our economic programs to be in a fully certificate program in our biblical seminary that at this point, we currently have 38 students in that program, and it just continues to build demand. And so why do I tell you all this? I think when I come back to 2 Kings 4, one of the beautiful things that Elisha, after the oil runs out, he tells the woman, go sell the oil, pay your debts, and you and your sons can live on what's left. Theologians will argue that he equipped this woman with an economic solution that if he would have just paid off her debt, she probably would have ended up in a similar situation because her children were too young. And in that context, there wasn't a lot of opportunity for women. And I find that to be so powerful, right? There was this long-term play. And when we talk about about help, and when we're serving churches, we're often helping them categorize between charity or relief work, restoration and rehabilitation of people, and this long-term development. And can we say that the church has really been stuck on this charity and relief side for a long time? That we often see churches and nonprofits become enablers of the same problems that we see. That is it really thriving community if the same neighbor has been here for 2 years, standing in line for 4 hours for a bag of food, right? And so how do we reimagine? And that's what I love about this, igniting imagination, right? How do we dream differently of what the church could be? I'm going to share a quick story of Jeremy. So little Jeremy, you see the little redhead mohawk. He used to show up to North Fresno Church playing basketball. Really happy kid. And part of the commitment of the church to adopt a apartment complex. And he showed up one day really sad. And he said, and Pastor Lauren asked him, what's going on? And he said, my dad is getting out of prison, but he usually ends up back in prison a week or two after, so I know I don't have a lot of time with him. And so Lauren says, well, you know what, invite him over here. I'd love to chat with him. And after chatting with Big Jeremy, who's wearing the Indiana Pacers jersey, found out that he really just wanted a job. And we continued to hear from pastors, and why we started Spark Tank is people kept saying, people are knocking on my door saying, Pastor, I just got out of prison, no one will hire me, what do I do? And the church was like, well, I'll refer you elsewhere, but never hearing from that person again. And so Big Jeremy gets a job, is working in that context, and after a couple weeks, this older man, hardened man, is knocking on the door, where's Pastor Lauren? Where's Pastor Lauren? And finally tracks down Lauren. She's like, hey, I'm Jeremy, 3 generations of Jeremy. What have you done with my son? He is working. He has a bank account. He cares about being in his son's life. And the power of the job in that context, when Rockpile Landscaping came to us in 2014 with this idea of we want to be a lily pad for people who are coming to us for barriers to employment onto their next employment opportunity, right? And Jeremy has since moved on to work in forestry. The wildfires that happened in California, they're doing a lot of the work out there now. But when I think of this story, I think of the flourishing of all things, this idea of shalom. And I feel like theologian Perry Yoder says it best. It's restoring things to the way God intended them to be in people, for people, and between people. This story gets me pumped because the 3 Jeremys ended up giving their lives to the Lord. And to this day still attend North Fresno Church. And now, I know they turned 10 this year, so that was a really exciting venture for us to finally have one in the double digits, because we've been around, it's our 11th year, but to see one of our models just take off. I think of Cornerstone Coffee Company. This was, think of a church that had a really fantastic space in downtown Fresno that was running a coffee shop for 3 hours on Sundays for service, and then it laid empty the rest of the week. And so Vicki Luna, who's the founder of Lighthouse Recovery Program, which is a shelter and recovery home for women coming out of domestic violence and substance abuse, was volunteering in that coffee shop. And in Spark Tank, part of what we helped them imagine in 2014 was, can we take over that coffee shop and make it a full-fledged coffee shop that for her wraparound service, the one thing that was missing was providing workforce experience that was trauma-informed. And for the church, is here's a dormant asset that we have. How do we bring it to life? And so now Vicki runs Cornerstone Coffee Company in downtown Fresno and hires dozens of women a year to get work experience to transition back into society. And the proceeds of that program go to supporting the Lighthouse Recovery Program. And not only are we looking to sell more cups of coffee, because there's nothing really missional about cups of coffee, but really for us, how do we manage and measure for impact, where we are saying we need to sell 40 cups of Americanos this day because we need to pay for a bed for a woman tonight, right? So how do we connect both the God's economy and the impact that they look to have? And then finally, I think of Josie. Right, in Josie's story, where she came to us and she had been missing at church and then at First Presbyterian Church, and her pastor tracked her down and realized she had a payday loan and she was really ashamed to come to church. And after about 9 weeks, she comes in holding this little piece of paper. She's jumping up and down, and a little bit, you see Josie, and she says, I'm free, and I'm never going back to those slaveholders again. And the beauty that it was to see her and her son move out of that 1-bedroom apartment complex that we're stuck in into more full-time housing for them. And so I kind of wrap up our time today and just sharing part of my journey, and even this idea that, my dear mentor gave me was this idea that we dream of a Fresno that works for every neighbor in every part of our city all of the time so that no one gets left out. I think of my own personal life where, single parent household, I was getting into a lot of trouble. And maybe you heard me the other day talk about how I think the catalyst point for me was outrunning the cops and the sheriff showing up the next day. And so rather than being sent home because my mom wasn't home, I got to stay in the office. And someone, the cross-country coach at that time, just sat with me and said, Carlos, like, how are you doing? And like any teenager with the prefrontal cortex that's developing, I said, I'm fine. And he follows up, and this man says, Carlos, how are you really doing? What do you need? And at 16 years old, the waterworks started. Because in that sense, no one had ever stopped to ask me what was wrong. I found myself running with the wrong crowd. One of my closest friends was gunned down near me. My girlfriend passed away in a car accident the next month. My father had left recently, my family, so there's a lot of pent-up anger, and so I was trying to manifest that in some way. And he just said, God has a different call for your life. And that awakened something in me that if this man did not pause, if he was not in my hood at that time, I don't think I'd be here today. And so I'll leave you with this. I often think of Ken Uniter's words of, we're workers, we're not master builders. We're ministers, not messiahs, and we are prophets of a future not our own. Thank you, everyone.